Fair Play, a novel by Pete Fisher. Chapter 9. Bright Lights, Big City. Martin woke up that morning with a fuzzy, muzzy head. The sunlight coming through the curtains made him wince. With half-closed eyes, he glanced at the alarm clock. He'd never make the morning lecture. What the fuck? He'd asked someone to lend him their notes. He went into the kitchen, put the kettle on, and made an instant coffee. He sat down at the kitchen table and rolled himself a cigarette. Toast would have been nice. No bread in the bread bin. No one had done the shopping. Have to be a sandwich at college. The tide had turned. Martin was enjoying life as a student in London. The college had assigned him a flat with two guys who both smoked dope and were really into music. Tim was an ex-public schoolboy. He had that irritatingly posh accent and occasionally overbearing manner. But he did have a great album collection, and he was a drummer. Kevin was a soft-spoken, working-class lad from Liverpool. He also had an excellent album collection, very different from either Tim's or Martin's. He had a strong Scouse accent. Tim would sometimes take the piss and try and mimic him. He'd stop abruptly when he noticed Kevin slowly clenching his fist. Most evenings the three of them would get wrecked on cheap wine and consecutive joints. They'd listen to the formidable combined collection of vinyl in Martin's room on the combined stereo system at an unsociable volume. Unfortunately, the landlady lived on the ground floor and would regularly bang on the door, demanding that they turn that noise down. Nowadays, Martin liked to ease himself into the day. He was making up for all those mornings, having to get up at 6 a.m. to drive a bread van. After his coffee and cigarette, he grabbed a few books and his A4 notepad and stuffed them into a shoulder bag. He went downstairs and out of the front door of the prim semi-detached house. It was a 10-minute walk across the park to the tube station. Trains were comparatively scarce out in the suburbs, so a 15-minute wait was not uncommon. If he was skint and there was no one around, he'd leap over the entrance barrier and get a free ride. Martin emerged from the tube station onto the busy Mile End Road in the heart of the East End. This was where the Cray brothers used to rule the roost. The college was another 5 minutes' walk. A little island of posh academia in the midst of many cultures. It was soon after midday. The student union bar would just be opening. In warm weather you could sit outside and lounge against the wall in the sun. Today was a chilly autumn day. Martin went inside and ordered a pint. Everything was subsidised by 30%. He got himself a baguette. The pasties looked a bit dodgy. Martin had swiftly got into bad habits. He only attended lunchtime tutorials and afternoon lectures. No one really kept a record of attendance. You did have to write essays. There was no fooling the tutors as to who was slacking or not. They weren't going to stop your grant, but if you didn't study, you wouldn't get a degree. Martin was far more interested in getting a band together. He already had Tim on drums, although he'd never heard him play. Tom was a little long-haired guy with a retro hippie vibe. He said he played guitar, but would be willing to have a go on bass. He liked to sit up in the furthest corner of the bar, alone, smoking a large joint, while enjoying his pint and reading The Guardian. After having given it a few days' thought, Tom announced that he'd bought a bass and an amp. Around that time, Tim and Martin also got to know John. He played keyboards. He had an electric piano and an amp and was keen to join the band. He was a bit strange and uptight, kind of mad professorish. The band could use the music room at lunchtime. It was virtually never used and empty save for an out-of-tune upright piano in one corner. It would be perfect for rehearsals, but it was right next door to one of the lecture theatres. The union guy reluctantly agreed to a couple of rehearsals a week. On the day of the first rehearsal, Martin struggled in on the tube with his heavy old Vox amp in one hand and his guitar case in the other. Tim got his dad to drive him into college from home. Tom managed to get his bass gear, and John dragged along his piano and amp. The college had a small PA system, which Tim persuaded the union guy to liberate from the store cupboard. Martin was by far the most experienced musician in the room, even though he'd only been playing guitar seriously for a few years. Once again, he found himself in front of the microphone, doing the singing and directing. Unfortunately, despite all his bravado, Tim was a pretty lousy timekeeper. It was touch and go whether he'd find the one beat again when he went round the kit for a fill. John was a pretty good keyboard player, classically trained, but he had no feel or groove. He tended to speed up too. Tom had never played bass before. His small fingers struggled to fret the notes. He struggled to find a bass line that would fit. He also didn't have the ear. He couldn't even get his bass properly in tune. This was not how Martin had imagined it. They met up a couple of times a week and jammed around. They gradually assembled a short set list of favourites. Martin impressed the others with his playing. He did his best to encourage rather than criticise. The last thing he wanted to do was piss anyone off. For now, he was going to have to be content with an amateur jam band going nowhere. Martin drifted along, living his lazy, decadent student life. One day in the bar at lunchtime, he spotted a poster for the end-of-term dance. When Tim came in, Martin asked him if he reckoned they could get a gig. There was a disco, but no live band. The hall had a nice big stage. Tim was on good terms with the student union guy, who was also posh public school. The union guy said okay. Free beers, but no money. Martin wanted a decent guitar to play that night. Vince, the hash dealer, had told Martin that a friend of his had a lovely early 60s Gibson 335. He might be willing to lend it to Martin for the gig. The dance was on the last Friday of the spring term. By around 8:30, the hall was packed. The student crowd was boogieing enthusiastically to the latest disco tunes. The band were making the most of the free beer rider. There was a handy back room that served as a dressing room, although no one was dressing up. Martin was tuning the precious Gibson. It had rusty old strings that its owner had insisted he didn't change. Tom was rolling an enormous long spliff. Tim was drumming annoyingly on every available surface. John was chain-smoking and grinding his teeth. He was smiling that curious smile of his. He looked like he'd just eaten something that didn't agree with him. The band ambled onto the stage around 9, as arranged. The DJ doggedly continued playing disco. Martin had to ask him to stop over the PA. A mixture of boos and cheers from the crowd. The sound on the stage was pretty atrocious. The hall had terrible acoustics, with everything reflecting off the back wall. Tom's bass was droning out of tune. Martin was shouting at him and making tuning up gestures. Tim played like a man possessed. At times he seemed to be playing a different song to the rest of the band. John looked like he was in agony. His face was screwed up in concentration. He played like a clockwork toy, all jerky and devoid of groove. Martin did his best under difficult circumstances. The lovely Gibson sounded superb, but it tended to squeal with feedback at the most inopportune moments. The guy out front doing the PA struggled at first. After a few songs, he had the sound sorted out. He added 50s rock and roll slapback echo to the guitar and vocals. He also cranked up Martin's guitar when he did a solo. The crowd took a while to warm up, but by the end they were cheering for more. The band rounded the evening off with a medley of easy-to-play Beatles songs. Before the crowd had stopped cheering, the DJ resumed his disco onslaught. The band waved and disappeared into the backstage room, sweating and triumphant. Martin was delighted, but exhausted. He wiped the Gibson down and put it safely into its battered case. Martin went out into the hall and pushed through the crowd to get to the bar. Friends came up to congratulate him. The free beer flowed. It was the first proper gig Martin had played in London. While he was standing at the bar, clutching a pint and a well-earned cigarette, a guy he didn't know came up to him. Martin assumed he was a student. He looked a bit too well turned out, though. He was good-looking, in his early 20s, shortish, fashionably styled hair, well-cut jacket, white shirt, narrow jeans. "Hi, that was great. Really enjoyed it. Loved your slide guitar. Beatles covers were cool. You really ought to have a better band." Martin was flattered, but glad his bandmates were safely out of earshot. "It's just a college band. Most of the guys have never done any gigs before. But you have though, all right? Thought your solos were great. That Gibson sounds really good through the Vox amp." "Thanks, it's borrowed." "I'm Chris, by the way. I play a bit too, and I write songs. I want to try and get them published, maybe get a record deal. I've got a guy lined up who wants to manage me. I need to record some demos first. I can't afford pro musicians, so I'm looking for a band." Chris scribbled his name and phone number on a beer mat and handed it to Martin. "Give me a ring, okay? Nice to meet you. Gotta go. Keep in touch." "Yeah, right. See ya." Martin stared at the beer mat. He wondered if anything would come of it. He went over to where Tim was chatting up a couple of girls. "You'll never guess what? This guy just told me he needs a band to play on some studio demos." "Bloody hell, he must be desperate." Tim was too intent on scoring to take him seriously. Martin put the beer mat in his back pocket and ordered a last free pint. One of the girls on his course came up and started flirting with him. She was drunk. He wasn't interested. He had other things on his mind.